You couldn't be a young Humphrey staffer and not have had the experience of showing up at Waverly to pick him up to go on some journey, thinking that you were on a major adventure and that you were going to get in the car and learn all about public policy, which indeed you did, as he would regale you with stories of being with Khrushchev or debating with Nixon or one thing or another. But if you arrived on an autumn day too early, you would discover that before you got in the car to go off on your trip, you might have a rake in your hand and be meticulously raking his lawn, because Humphrey was a very meticulous person, and there was no leaf that was allowed to be left on that lawn. So there were little things like that. But when driving in a car with him, I mean, whether there were two of us or three of us in the car, you know, I mean, counting him, it would be one extraordinary story, thing after another. He knew everybody. Everybody knew him from great to small. You would stop at a gas station, and it would be shocking. There would be somebody who would show up who of course, everybody recognized and knew him. A crowd would gather right away. But the amazing thing is, the more times than not, somebody would show up and Humphrey knew them. It was unbelievable. And it's true, the stories about him remembering people's names, it's absolutely true. It was just uncanny, the way to remember names. But then you'd get in the car and he would tell stories of all these great figures of history that he'd had this direct interaction, and he knew them as human beings and so forth. But I have to say, on a personal recollection, when I think of this kind of thing, there's this moment that my words could not express. It's funny, I get teary-eyed just even thinking about it. I think we were in Crookston. We were either in Crookston or Morris. We were flying around that day. And we were in a school. He had been given an address, I think, to a farmers union group. And we were racing. Of course, Humphrey was always late, terribly late. And we were racing down a hallway to get him in the car, to get back to the airplane, to go to the next stop, where we were, we had a crowd waiting. It was terribly, terribly late. This would have been in 75 or 76. I think it was probably his last campaign in 76, where I was working on very, very intensely. And he was 10 steps ahead of me. Normally, the advanced person or person with him is supposed to be in front, but Humphrey's 10 feet ahead of me. And out from a restroom comes a very, very elderly woman with a walker. And she looked down the hallway and saw Humphrey, and I'm on the other side of this woman. And she just stopped, kind of mesmerized. You could see that this was important to her. And somehow Humphrey stopped dead in his tracks. It was absolutely clear that with her to his back, he could sense that there was some human being back there who wanted to say something. And he turned around, went beeline right to her. And it wasn't about glad-handing politics. It was about, there was a human being there who wanted to be close to him and say something to him, and kind of share her humanity and share his. And it was just this extraordinary, exquisite moment of sensitivity on his part, that of radar, that was, it was beyond politics. It was just magical. And it was a moment when, forget all the extraordinary legislation. There was just, in that moment, it encapsulated this greatness of being a human being that was extraordinary. I've never forgotten it. You can't talk about Humphrey in terms of policy without looking at the entire extraordinary contribution to civil rights issues in our society. You look at his speech in 1948 at the Philadelphia National Convention, that very famous speech that's really one of the great speeches of American political life, and not just for those of us who are Humphrey enthusiasts, but recognized by scholars as being one of the great moments. There was courage in that speech, there was inspiration, but then following that, before it too, by the way, but following that was this incredible career of trying to deal with this incredible, dark stain in American history of how we have operated, how we handled a significant portion of our population, how we related to them as a group, to the African Americans, and for that matter, derivative of that, to all people who are not of Northern European ancestry. Humphrey believed deeply about that in his heart. It wasn't a case of being sympathetic, I think, to African Americans. I think it was a case of being sympathetic to human beings He saw everybody as being equal, and though he'd grown up in South Dakota, where I doubt there were many African Americans, he just didn't understand how anybody could have a value judgment that one human being was inherently better than another one, and therefore better to the point of being able to discriminate. And Humphrey was a person of action in his daily deeds and his public policy, and he provided extraordinary leadership, the spirit of that whole thing. If it wasn't for Hubert Humphrey, we wouldn't have had important things, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, any number of things in that regard. That's the hallmark of his career. You know, separate of that, you step away from civil rights, the list of accomplishments that he was part of, or the originator of, is extraordinary. Everything from the Peace Corps, which was entirely his idea. President Kennedy literally picked up the phone and called him after he'd become president and said, Hubert, could I borrow your idea? Could I take your idea? Because I think the idea of sending young Americans around the world to be helpful and to show the spirit of who America is and how to be helpful would be a good thing for our country and for our own young people. This was all Hubert Humphrey's idea. He was the idea machine, really, more than anybody else of that, you know, of those early 1960s. And I think, with all due respect to the Kennedy administration, of the Kennedy that. But that, his work on health and human service issues, whether it's Medicare, whether it's equal employment issues for everybody, educational issues, funding for our cultural matters. It's rather extraordinary. You look at the list of things that he was involved in. He was the first author of any kind of nuclear disarmament issues in our world. If you look at major consequential public actions of the last 50 years, you'll find that an extraordinarily disproportionate share of them were championed, if not originated, by Hubert Horatio Humphrey. It's kind of a breathtaking thing.